of Kira Johnson. So, Kira Johnson, we won't be able to trust our doctors and medical professionals to take care of us and to do their jobs ethically, professionally, correctly. Unfortunately, sometimes being able to trust them, we just can't. It's not the case. And this can be for a variety of reasons. And in some cases, the reasons are race-related, as was the case here. Kira Johnson's husband, Charles, has referred to her death as more than a medical tragedy, but a catastrophe, one which could have been prevented, and it could have. This case takes place on April 12th, 2016 in Los Angeles, California. Kira Johnson was a healthy mother to her son, Charles Jr., and she was preparing to give birth to her second child, who she would name Langston. 39-year-old Kira Johnson went into the hospital for a routine C-section, her second C-section, and died within hours of her son's birth. Johnson spoke 5 different languages, 4 of which she spoke fluently. She raced cars, she traveled, she ran marathons, she had her pilot's license, she went skydiving. She had an incredible education, she had multiple degrees. She was fit, healthy, and took excellent care of herself. To her husband Charles, she was sunshine personified. She and her husband had been married 10 years. They had a son together when this tragedy occurred. Their son, Charles Jr., was 19 months old when she gave birth via C-section to her son, Langston. Her C-section was a procedure which, for the second one, was completed in 17 minutes. It was done way too quickly. It was done sloppily. And that 17 minutes would go on to cost Kira her life. Kira's son was born at 2:19 p.m. Kira and Charles waited for hours to receive needed care which would come too late for her. The procedure was completed sloppily, and it was described as butchery, according to attorney Nicholas Rowley when speaking of the procedure. It shocked everybody that we deposed, all the healthcare providers, even the head of obstetrics. Here, the head of labor and delivery looked at it and said, "No, I've never seen one done that fast." Following the procedure, Kira expressed to her husband that she was experiencing severe pain from her abdomen. Within hours, she said, shaking. The pallor of her skin was really concerning. She was noticeably sensitive to touch. She and Charles also noticed that her catheter was turning pink, as there was blood in it, the bag. Things were clearly serious at this point. Charles and family pleaded with hospital staff to examine Kira and run tests. They did conduct blood work, which indicated irregularities in her blood. But aside from that, nothing. The family begged them to conduct a CT scan, which was allegedly ordered, but they continued having to wait for the doctors to take action. The light pink blood in her catheter eventually became bright red. After hours of waiting, her body eventually began going into shock. Her husband continually begged hospital staff to examine her and take action. Nothing. Kira remained in agony for over 10 hours with minimal to no response from hospital staff. By the time Kira made it into emergency surgery, it was too late. Internal bleeding had been ongoing throughout those 10 hours of waiting. They found 3 liters of blood in her abdomen. Doctors had unknowingly inflicted a deep gash to her bladder when conducting the C-section. She died on the table, her heart stopping. So, April 13th, 2016, at 2:22 a.m., she passed away. Her death resulting from a postpartum hemorrhage. She had not been sutured properly. Additionally, when her catheter bag was bright red, hospital staff had switched the bags out and they saw the blood, which indicates willful neglect of a patient. When Charles approached the medical staff about concerns for his wife's health, they one of the nurses responded by saying that his wife was not a priority right now. When later examined, it was found that 90% of Kira's blood was in her stomach at the time of her death. I also wanted to note that her medical records indicated at 6:30 p.m. that her condition was a surgical emergency, but this emergency was not acted upon for hours. Kira's death was a result of a culture of racism. Charles had to remain calm. If he became angry or yelled, if he slammed his fist on a table, as a black man, he would have been viewed as a threat. Her husband is quoted as saying, "The reality is that on April 12, 2016, when we walked into Cedars-Sinai Hospital for what we expected to be the happiest day of our lives, the greatest risk factor that Kira Dixon Johnson faced was racism." Charles goes on to file 2 lawsuits against the hospital and staff responsible for his wife's death. Kira's husband, Charles, sues the hospital over racial discrimination, which resulted in his wife's death. Following Kira's death, the Johnson family moved to Atlanta, Georgia, so Charles' mother could help him raise the boys. So also wanted to mention that when Charles spoke with the hospital to gain more information regarding his wife's death, they reacted disdainfully. They sidestepped any responsibility, any wrongdoing on the hospital's part, or any explanation what went so wrong. So he had to do something because no one was in his corner in the hospital. They weren't taking responsibility. She died despite the fact that her death could have been prevented. Her injury is a common cause of maternal death. One reason women of color die more frequently compared to white women. The hospital refused to answer questions or take action in response. It was not that she was sick. It's not that she had a pre-existing condition, that she had a heart problem or a blood clot. None of that was part of this case. That's according to her mother-in-law, Judge Hatchett. Charles wanted the doctor responsible to answer for their wrongdoings, their inaction. My apologies for the background noise. I had to, like I said, in another video, I mentioned that I had to move to another spot to record. So this spot has got some noise. I'm very sorry. Anyways, it was brought to Charles Johnson's attention that the doctor who operated on his wife was also responsible for other cases leading to the deaths of 3 other women. He ended up with 4 years of probation from the California Medical Board, which was just incredibly light, especially in contrast to typical sentencing guidelines for cases like this particular case. Had this doctor answered for these instances and his license been taken away, Kira might not have died, right? She might have been alive today. I also think it's kind of interesting that Judge Glenda Hackett, I think that's Hackett, sorry, happens to be the mother of Charles Johnson, and she's a court TV judge, and she was able to use her platform to bring more media attention to the case and to Kira's tragic death. She assisted her son also in acquiring a lawyer to pursue a suit against the hospital. Charles filed 2 suits: wrongful death, negligence against the hospital, Cedars-Sinai, and a second, which is a civil rights lawsuit asserting the hospital and doctor are responsible for her death and for the emotional distress inflamed by racism. The civil rights lawsuit was filed in 2022 for failing to provide equal access, citing in depositions a noticeable disparity in care of women of color versus care of white women at Cedars-Sinai. It is difficult to prove a civil rights violation within a healthcare setting, since doing so requires them to show the discrimination was intentional. Sometimes this this something that they subconsciously do because they're prejudiced and they don't even realize it. And even if you know for sure that they did it because they're racist, can you prove that they knew what they were doing was wrong? You know what I mean? It's tricky. That's why racial trauma is so, one of the reasons it's so difficult, because there's this ambiguity almost of like, was that really racist? Did they mean to be racist? And that actually can be more damaging to one's psyche than like obvious racism, because it like messes with your head, you know, and it's very stressful. So I thought that was an interesting thing that I learned during research for a project. So obstetrician and gynecologist Dr. Kimberly Gregory testified about how she lives with structural racism on a daily basis, which deters black patients from access to the same care as their white counterparts. She also asserted that Kira clearly should have been brought back to surgery much earlier. One surgical technologist, Angelique Washington, said patient safety was out the door. When Kira was brought into the OR, she too had observed patient safety was out the door when Kira was brought into the OR. She too, Washington too, has observed differences in patient treatment based on one's color of their skin. She goes on to say, when I see my black patients come in, I say an extra prayer. Attorney Rowley says Kira died because she's black. Women of color don't get the same treatment as white women. That's a fact. Kira's husband said every single woman in this country should have the right to give birth to a healthy baby and live to raise that child, period. It is important to note that racism impacts the physical body based on stress alone. For black women in America, an inescapable atmosphere of societal and systemic racism can create a kind of toxic physiological stress, resulting in conditions including hypertension, preeclampsia, that lead directly to higher rates of infants and maternal death. These high mortality rates are a human concern. The right to live. Maternity mortality prevention bill. So the bill passed where $12 million over a year, over 5 years, would go towards preventing deaths of mothers of color during pregnancy and after. So it ends up totaling like $60 million. Also, CDC has indicated, according to an article from 2018, that annually 700 women die from complications in pregnancy and delivery, with 50,000 women experiencing serious complications. According to statistics from 2018, the U.S. has been considered one of the worst developed countries when regarding maternal mortality rates within time frame of giving birth and the year following. Deaths resulting from consequences of birth complications. Bill has provided funds to maternal health boards or committees to explore the data and better understand the problems causing such high rates of mortality in pregnant women, particularly those of color. This is to help towards prevention and hopes of further policy changes based on informed understanding. So, Kira's husband, Charles, founded an organization in 2017 called For Kira, For Moms, a nonprofit aimed at addressing the severe mortality rate of mothers during pregnancy in the U.S., especially when it comes to women of color, who, again, are 3 times more likely to die during pregnancy and birth in a first world country compared to white women, which is strange and unusual if you think about it. 60% of maternal deaths are considered preventable. The high maternal mortality rate can absolutely be attributed to responsiveness of staff, stress associated with pregnancy, with racism, and due to discrimination of towards women of color during pregnancy and birthing process. Kira Johnson is only one of many black women who die in childbirth. No matter how educated they are, how wealthy they are, or their marital status. Another example is Serena nearly died in childbirth. Both women well off, well educated, and incredibly healthy. Both incredibly healthy. So the rate, according to an article from 2017, the rate in the US for mortality in pregnancy is higher and more disproportionate, even compared to mortality rates in countries like Mexico, which have higher populations of poverty. Think about that. Even in some places with more poverty than the US, mortality rates are still higher in the US, or disproportionate. I think that says it all. There's also a book. It's called I Remember Mommy, and it was written by Talitha Enyabwele. Sorry if I say that wrong. And it's about Kira Johnson. So I really liked this quote, so I wanted to include this here. There is no statistic that can quantify what it's like to tell an 18-month-old that his mother is never coming home. Life without Kira in the Johnson household. Charles, in 2018, talked about how he goes over that day in his mind, saying, I sit awake at nights thinking, maybe I should have grabbed somebody by the collar. Maybe I should have turned a table over. Would that have made a difference? Even 2 years later, this is when the quote came out, was 2 years after it happened. But anyway, so even 2 years later, I still can't make sense of it in my mind. Charles maintains his wife's memory with their young sons. Images of Kira, large poster-size images, featured on the walls of their home. He shows the children videos of their mother and strives to incorporate her spirited, adventurous nature in his parenting and the activities he and his sons engage in. He strives to do things in a way he refers to as Kira style. When he wakes up, he promises that he'll make his wife proud. Today, their kids should be roughly 7 and 9 years old. In an interview, her husband recalls their son Charles Jr. asking him if his mommy likes soccer, saying, well, can she come to my game? At the time of this interview, the children were only 2 and 4. So Charles Jr. was 4. In another instance, he asked if his mommy was mad at him and why she won't come home. He would explain to the children that their mommy is in heaven, doing important work with God. To her husband Charles, these moments are most painful to him. So I wanted to leave you with one last thought regarding this case. So Charles Johnson, when talking about his experience with Kira during her second C-section, the one that took her life, the thing that we are clear about is that there was a failure for the staff and the team at Cedars to see my wife the same way that they would view their daughter, their sister, or their wife. Kira deserved so much better. So thank you so much for watching. I really hope that you got something out of this video. And if you did, please like and subscribe for more similar content.